Another extraordinary week where history has just unfolded in front of our eyes. And you just feel it when you're watching Lise Doucet on the news. It's history on my TV, in my living room, with images that I'll never forget.
And images that are profoundly upsetting. And one of the ones this week that I think is probably the most shocking is the image of a pregnant woman being taken out of a bombed out hospital, the maternity and children's hospital in Mariupol, which was shelled by the Russians, causing enormous suffering, and with children and women being hurt, some people losing their lives. Just shocking to the extreme.
And I know I'll always talk about the ripples that spread out from beyond the actual event itself. There was one of them at an international gymnastics competition where the Russian gymnast Ivan Kuliak was wearing a Z symbol on his vest. And the Zs is what the Russian forces wear on the ground in Ukraine.
And then there's some images also of astonishing light and that show you about the human spirit, as well as all the sort of mega politics of, oil sanctions, energy sanctions, bombing, shelling, then just some of these incredibly human moments. A video was posted of a little girl singing Let It Go from Frozen, which either is one of your favourite or most hated songs, depending on your personal circumstances. But this young girl singing such a famous song in Ukrainian, underground, in a bunker, hiding and sheltering from Russian bombing. Let's have a listen to that.
Отпусти и забудь, что прошло уже не вернуть. Отпусти и забудь, новый день он кажет путь.
Браво, браво!
So that's some of the images of the week. We'll talk about what it all means on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And Laura in the studio.
And Chris in Sheffield.
You're away again.
I am. I'm away in documentary land, but popping back for Newscast, why not?
Okay, well, keeping us company in the studio is our podcasting cousin, Gabriel Gatehouse, who presents Ukrainecast and is often on Newsnight. Hello, Gabriel.
Hello.
Now, this week, President Zelensky did that amazing address to Parliament where he went through every single day of the conflict so far and kind of picked out one thing that had happened. Do you want to do your version of kind of what's happened today?
My clip of the day was Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, after he came out from those fruitless talks with his Ukrainian counterpart. And he started off really positively and reassuringly. He said, we're not going to attack any other countries. We have no intention of attacking any other countries. In fact, we've never attacked Ukraine. I was like, oh, OK, well, I hope you don't not attack the other countries in the same way as you have not attacked Ukraine. This is the kind of Orwellian topsy-turvy world that the Ukrainians are dealing with, but we're all trying to make sense of.
And in terms of chemical weapons, that's something that has come into the conversation this week, isn't it? And in fact, the Prime Minister tonight has acknowledged that that's a risk. We've heard the Foreign Secretary talk about it too.
Yeah. So the
What's your
Americans,
take?
well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because my instinct is always to take these very public intelligence assessments with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we remember Iraq, we remember weapons of mass destruction, and I think that taught us all a lesson. And I'm always suspicious of people saying so-and-so is preparing to do something really terrible. On the other hand, we heard a lot about intelligence assessments in the run-up to the invasion. We heard the Americans and the Brits saying, hey guys, they're about to invade. And I was deeply skeptical. I was like, I don't think so. It doesn't really make any sense. And of course they were right. So, well, it's worrying. And it's especially worrying because we look at what happened in Syria and there is basically precedent for that. And frankly, as far as the Kremlin's concerned, the Russian campaign's not going very well.
Gabriel, talk to us about Russians, ordinary Russian people. We've seen, obviously, the scale of the suffering in Ukraine on the television every day for the last few weeks now. But give us a sense of the kind of conversations that are going on amongst ordinary Russians looking in on this conflict in so much as they can, given the state media, and seeing what's being done, well, I guess, in their name.
Yeah, well, some of them, including most of my friends, are absolutely horrified. You know, I have friends who woke up on the first day of the invasion, and said they felt like they'd woken up in Nazi Germany. Right? That's the kind of level of level of horror and shame and feelings of powerlessness and helplessness that are coming out of that sort of part of the Russian society, which is under no illusion as to what the Putin regime was, but then it turned out something much worse than they thought. Of course, there are lots of other Russians. There's a whole bunch of Russians who buy the state media propaganda that they're fighting some kind of phantom Nazi threat, which, to be clear, is nonsense, right? We're not going to kind of equivocate over that. It's nonsense. But then I think that there's a huge sort of section of people in the middle who simply feel powerless to affect any kind of change, right? They could go out into the streets, that would only get them arrested and sent to jail. It's not going to change anything. They have for so many years felt powerless to affect the direction of their country. And I think that's a very different mindset to think yourself into from where we're sitting here. But what's really interesting is over the past few weeks, I've been trying to get an insight into what does the sort of close circle around Putin think, the people in the greater Kremlin, if you like, the oligarchs, the strong men, and the apparatchiks. And the picture that's emerging is that A, they didn't know he was going to do this, and B, they also feel helpless to affect any change. So the picture we're getting, both on the streets, as it were, and kind of right at the top, is of a country led by an increasingly isolated and unpredictable leader.
Well, yeah, because you mentioned the oligarchs, and today the UK finally put sanctions on Roman Abramovich. And as a Russian expert, you will probably correct my pronunciation of that.
It's actually Abramovich, because Abramovich is a patronymic. So Boris Berezovsky's patronymic was Abramovich.
Okay.
But Abramovich is the surname. But
Because you're named after your dad.
niche.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I was going to say, for me and newscasters, patronymic being named after your
dad's
dad.
name,
Right,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
That's fine. Neil McNeil, Donald McDonald, that kind of thing. Right,
Yeah.
sorry. As
But
you
I
are.
was going to say, because the subtext, though, of the press release that came out today announcing the sanctions on Abramovich and 6 other oligarchs is kind of like, oh, and these guys will be so pained by these sanctions, they'll call up Putin and get him to pull the tanks back. I mean, that's not really how it's going to work, is it?
Maybe once upon a time that might have worked a bit more. I mean, it wouldn't have worked like that, but they might have had a bit more effect. I mean, I think of Putin's power as this three-legged stool, right? So it's the oligarchs is one, for sure. The apparatchiks, like the Lavrovs and the prime minister, the kind of professional politicians who basically do what they're told and make the system run. That's the second leg of the stool. But the third and increasingly more important leg of the stool is what's known as the siloviki, literally the strong men. Right? These are people from the intelligence services, the security agencies, the military. And I think what has happened over the past few years that I hadn't appreciated, which is why I and, ironically enough, most of the people who know Russia best were taken by surprise, or thought they knew Russia best, were taken by surprise by this, is that the siloviki has become increasingly powerful and an increasingly small circle. And that is why I think you can sanction the oligarchs, and it will have an effect. It will have a big effect on what's going on in Russia. But it won't necessarily change Putin's direction or get rid of it.
So if that's not going to change things, can the international community have any impact? James Landale, our diplomatic correspondent and friend of the podcast, is at some talks in Turkey that have been going on. James, I think it's in Antalya. What's been happening there today? And is there any sense of any glimmer of light, or are people just, I suppose, talking round in circles?
Well, welcome to my glamorous workspace in the hotel. Antalya is an extraordinary sort of resort city on the southern Turkish coast. There's a massive strip of very large hotels. I have to say, an awful lot of Russians have come here in the past. So there's an irony that this was the place chosen for a little bit of Turkish diplomacy. The really strange thing was we all piled into this big hotel where the talks were taking place, hundreds of journalists, all of us hanging on every word. And yet the words that came out, particularly from the Russian side and Mr. Lavrov, was this sort of torrent of sort of, rambling thoughts and words. And it suddenly became very clear, not just, making allegations about, as Gabriel said, no invasion taking place, but just sort of random stuff about biological warfare being engendered by the Americans in Ukraine. He again accused everybody, Ukraine of being Nazis, and this stuff just sort of came tumbling out. He accused the Ukrainians of using civilians as human shields, all of this sort of stuff. And we suddenly realised that there was no progress at all. There was no sense, even in the language, the body language, of saying, yeah, let's see if we can find a deal here. We're far apart. Is there any common ground? There wasn't even any of that. Both sides were just talking straight past each other.
But from the Ukrainian perspective, it's very hard to see how they can find some common ground to even talk about, because what the Russians are demanding is what they call the denazification of Ukraine, and of course, that is a phantom. That's like
exist.
It's
And yet again, we as observers went into this looking maybe being a little bit naive, because James, when we talked about this on a previous episode of the podcast this week, we were actually seriously talking about potential areas for climb down or compromise, and we took that sort of seriously.
Yeah. Well, what I think happened was that a Kremlin spokesman gave an interview to Reuters a few days ago in which the spokesman reiterated the Russian demands, i.e. Ukraine has to recognise that Crimea is Russian, they have to accept the independence of the two statelet republics in the east, it has to accept that Ukraine will be neutral and will never join the EU or NATO. And everybody said, those are terms for trade and negotiation. He's not mentioning denazification. Well, I have to say denazification was back in all its glory today. So I think that was an example of again, everybody slightly overinterpreting sometimes what is said. In a totally natural expectation of hope, of saying, well, maybe there is some common ground. But at the moment, on the basis of today, there's very little evidence of it.
Are they even willing, James, to say that they're going to continue talking?
Well, Mr. Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, was willing to do that. He said that. Mr. Lavrov, much less so. He said that the Ukrainians sometimes like to have meetings for the sake of having meetings. Which sort of raises the question, why was Lavrov here in the first place? Because it seems to have been that he came here simply for no other reason than to say, I was here, and so that no one can accuse him or the Russians of not being at least willing to talk. But as far as we can tell, he did not come with anything on the table. One of the frustrations of the Ukrainian foreign minister was he said, I put forward these ideas of a 24-hour ceasefire, a humanitarian corridor out of Mariupol, but Lavrov, he said, did not seem empowered to discuss that in any meaningful sense or even accept any agreement on that. And I think that's one of the curious things about this.
That is a really key point. It's interesting you say that, James, because I think what we've learnt in the past couple of weeks is that nobody, apart from Putin, has any idea what Russia's policy is now. So everyone is guessing and waiting. And my guess would be, from what you just said, James, is that Lavrov hasn't got a clear steer from Putin as to what he should be talking about, and so is just sort of spouting out the Nazi nonsense.
Dangerous guessing game for everyone, even his closest allies. James, thank you so much for popping up. I know you've got a long list of things to get through tonight, so thank you as ever for being on. And I mean, guys, all the while all of this happens, a dialogue of the deaf, all of this sort of diplomacy, but maybe not real if the Russians have got no intention of even offering a genuine conversation.
I should just add that I spoke to Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister on, what day is it today? Thursday. On Wednesday, yes, on Wednesday, yesterday. And she said, I said, well, what are you going to talk about with Lavrov? She said, well, we're willing to discuss Russian reparations and their capitulation. So, so there is an element where there's kind of equally hardline lines coming out of both
and
sides.
for while the politicians aren't, are not anywhere remotely near any kind of discussion, of course, it's Ukrainians who are just suffering and suffering and suffering. And now we learned today as well, more than 2 million people have now left the country. One of them, of course, is Max and family, who you guys have been talking to almost daily on your podcast, Ukrainecast. Let's just show newscasters a bit of their story and then we'll have a chat about it.
And also, before you listen to this, you've got to think of the kind of map that Max has gone through from Ukraine to Moldova to Romania and then a plane to Israel.
But do we know what happened to him in the first place? He was basically in his apartment block, his flat in Kiev, and it got a direct hit from a missile, and he was there with his wife and two sons.
Well, let's check in with them now.
We were preparing the food, and luckily we were all together in the kitchen. And while the missile hit in the kids' room, and it's on the opposite side of the flat. And it was like complete hell, immediate blackout, fire and dust. And it was, for the God's sake, we managed to survive. I do not know how. It's like 1 billion chance balls.
How did you all feel when you got to Israel?
I felt myself, and I'm feeling myself like the happiest man in the world, to be able with the help of so many friends, so many great people, to be able to get my family in a safer place. And my son is telling me he read on the news in the Ukrainian social media right away that Russian troops had blocked the exit of more than 50 buses with the refugees, with the people being evacuated.
Okay. Was that Mark or George?
It was Mark.
I just wanted to say to Mark, we're so happy to see you and to talk to you. How are you?
A bit well, yeah. Preparing for the surgery tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah, hope for the good. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure it will go well. How do you feel about the fact that you are now safe in Jerusalem?
It's brilliant, I think, but the worry about other family who left in Ukraine, Kiev, Mariupol, and other cities, and much of my friends.
And that was your co-presenter of Ukrainecast, Victoria Derbyshire, talking to Mark while he was live in a hospital bed.
Yeah.
That's
It's
quite
pretty
amazing.
full on. And, he's just one among thousands who've been injured, and as you said, Laura, millions who've left. I would just like to say, amidst all of this, lots of Russians are having to leave their homes in Russia as well. I mean, I've got a friend I spoke to at the end of last week, and he was in a state of great excitement. He was like pumped with adrenaline, and he was like, we left. I grabbed my wife and my 3 kids under 12. We ran for the airport. We got the last tickets. We're in Dubai. It was like in the movies, he said. I was like, okay,
why, just because they thought this country's going down?
He's a journalist,
right.
And journalism is effectively now punishable by 15 years in jail. And nobody knows the parameters anymore, right? But before, you knew what you could get away with and where, but now, like, it's a guessing game. So he made a dash for it. He was pumped with adrenaline. When I spoke to him a few days later, the reality had sunk in, and he said to me, oh my God, I'm a refugee. What happened to my middle-class Moscow life? Like, it's gone. And he can't get any of his money out. He can't use his Visa cards because of the sanctions. So obviously they're not being bombed, but, I keep thinking if Ukraine comes through this with its independence intact, more or less, right, it's going to be a stronger country with a great sense of unity and purpose because of this experience. Obviously, it's a tragic experience, but it will come out of it stronger. Russia, it's dark times ahead.
Gabriel, talk to us about your recent trip to Chernobyl, because we've heard, haven't we, a lot of concern in the last couple of weeks about Ukraine's nuclear sites and how safe they are in the current context in terms of their maintenance, the whole business last week of one of them being shelled, or at least buildings close to it being shelled. Tell us about that trip.
Well, so I went to Chernobyl because it's right on the border with Belarus. And it's pretty much exactly at the point, like if you wanted to send a column of tanks down from the Belarusian border, which is where the Russians had this build-up of forces, if you wanted to send a column of tanks down to take Kiev, that would be the quickest route, right? You'd pretty much go through Chernobyl.
And Belarus is close to Russia with Lukashenko, an ally of Putin, and basically on his side, almost like a puppet government, right?
Exactly, a puppet government. So we went, that's why we went there, and it was extraordinary to see this place that had been such a factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? It was the fact that the nuclear reactor exploded, and that the Soviet government in Moscow didn't tell anyone about it for so long because they wanted to cover it up, and thereby exposing everyone to radiation, really, I think, woke people up in 1986 to the fact that their government didn't have their best interests at heart. And, so this is one of the major factors that led to Ukraine becoming an independent country in the first place. And just being there in this place, which obviously was abandoned afterwards. So it's like a time capsule, right? You're there in the middle of this little fairground, a little Soviet fairground with a frozen Ferris wheel and a bunch of frozen bumper cars. It's like this was the Soviet Union mid-1980s, and it's remained that way. And you really got this kind of strange premonition about which way the world was heading. But I could not bring myself to believe it then. And now, what are we at? It's about a month since I was there. It really feels like Russia is heading back to the Soviet past. I mean, Putin today has been talking about effectively nationalizing the foreign businesses and their assets that are ceasing to work in Russia. So I never thought I would use these two words next to each other in a sentence. He's talking about nationalizing McDonald's. I mean, this is mental.
That is spooky on quite a lot of levels. Gabriel, thank you so much, and thank you for joining our podcasting family.
I'm so happy to be part of your family. What am I, a cousin or a once removed a brother?
I'd go brother.
Half brother.
Bumped up to brother.
I think
already.
we said Ukraine because we said sister podcast. I think
Okay.
brothers in our.
I'll take that.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you.
Thanks.
Well, now we can chat to Labour's Lisa Nandy, who's the Shadow Secretary of State for Levelling Up. And like COVID times, she's joining us from our spare room. Hi, Lisa.
Hello. Good evening. What can I say? Good evening. When are we?
Well, it's podcasting, so it's all the time, really. But a lot of people will be watching this in the evening, so that's okay. So, well, first of all, I mean, the big news today, kind of on the home front, is that the Home Office is radically changing the visa scheme for Ukrainian people to come to the UK and join family members. They will not have to go to one of these processing centres across Europe and get in a big queue. From Tuesday, they'll be able to do it all digitally. I suppose you're very pleased that change has been made.
Yeah, absolutely relieved. You know, the reports that we've been getting from people who are being turned back at Calais are just appalling. And to ask people who've fled Putin, who've been witnessing bombing, shelling, who have young children to travel hundreds of miles in order to try and make an application, it's just unconscionable. So this change that Priti Patel announced today, it's very, very welcome, but it's just so achingly slow and piecemeal, when what we really need is to treat this as the extraordinary circumstance that it is. We've just been through a global pandemic. We've just seen what this country can do when we need to. And these are not ordinary times. These are extraordinary times. And we need to mobilise in extraordinary ways in order to get help to people now.
Lisa, it's Chris here. I hear your critique about what you describe as the government being far too slow in the last few days. But given what we now are hearing from the government, in precise terms, how are you in a different place from what they are advocating, other than your critique about their slowness as you see it?
So the first thing is we've got to drop the onerous visa requirements, because as well as being very, very difficult for people who are applying for family reunion, who are trying to come here through the family visa route, who still have to upload a whole series of documents that often they don't have, proving family connection, proving their own identities, and so on. It's more complicated when you get to the community sponsorship scheme, because they have to go through that process before they can even start the next stage of the process, which is being matched to the sponsor. And that's why it can take years.
But Lisa, right now, are you suggesting they're dropping all of the requirements so people don't have to show anything, give any evidence apart from very basic,
like a passport
security
or an ID
checks
card,
or identity checks? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, we've said we think that they should drop some of the bureaucracy, and people should be required to provide biometric data, which the armed forces have said they would stand ready and willing to help to try and process that very, very quickly. Basic identity checks, you know, we appreciate that some people won't have documentation, but given the sheer numbers of children that we're talking about, it is really, really important that we document who they are as they're coming into the country and where they're going.
So
because if you don't do that, I've seen it myself over the years when I used to work with child refugees, you will get child trafficking. So, you know, dropping all checks and requirements, absolutely not, because that is not in the interests of the people who are coming in. But we could cut some of the bureaucracy out right now. And the government has privately, I think there are some government ministers who are more responsive to that. I think Michael Gove is actually quite receptive to that, but doesn't seem to have any influence with the Home Office or the Cabinet Office. But that's the first thing that we should do, as well as sourcing accommodation. There's been no effort so far on the part of the government to source available accommodation. So even if they do announce details of this community sponsorship scheme, they're just not in a position to get up and running very quickly. It's just simply not good enough when we've got a crisis.
Where could they find, though, Lisa, on that specific around accommodation, where could they just find accommodation just like that? I'm just thinking about the practicalities here. Whilst clearly there's a demand from lots of people for more to be done, in practical terms, these things can take time, can't they? Whether it be housing, thinking about schooling, for instance, there's huge questions here.
But Chris, that's precisely the point. This is more complicated than previous cohorts of refugees that we've seen. For example, one of the charities today was telling me that because we're expecting a lot of older people, and you don't tend to get a lot of older refugees coming into the UK for reasons that are fairly obvious, there'll be different healthcare needs. We're not used to providing specialist refugee health support in areas like dementia, for example.
But so, Lisa, on exactly that point then...
has to move now, because if they don't move now, the support won't be there for years and years on end, and that's just simply not good enough. In terms of where you get the accommodation from, first thing they should do is set up a register so that they can keep a track of all of the people who are coming forward, the members of the public who are coming forward, who can offer accommodation and may act as sponsors. They could email local authorities. They haven't even picked up the phone to council leaders to ask them what accommodation capacity they've got in their own areas. This has been going on for weeks now, and yet not a single person in government has picked up the phone. It's just simply not good enough.
And Lisa, would Labour basically say that people should, the taxpayer should just stump up however much is required to look after these people? I know that some people might think that's an insensitive question to ask, but we obviously if people might come here for the very long term, you've just talked about healthcare needs, all kinds of things. Sadly, Ukrainians will not be able to be sure when, if ever, they might be able to go back to their country. Should the taxpayer be willing to stump up however much it takes to look after people who make it here?
Look, I was listening to Nadeem Zahawi, the Education Secretary, on Peston the other night, and he said, we've got to do our bit. He was talking about an uncapped number of people coming in through the community sponsorship scheme. I think the British public are way ahead of politicians on this. I think they know we've got to do our bit, and we're not currently doing it. 2 million people on the move, less than 1,000 visa applications have even been processed. There are apparently 22,000 that are still in the system that they haven't even started on, and that's before you even look at people who don't have family members here in the UK. So I think people are willing to do far more than we're currently doing, but we're not even talking about the taxpayer stumping up large amounts of cash. We're talking about whether we let anybody in at all, and at the moment we're just simply not doing it. There are practical barriers, there are big problems with the system as it currently stands. Before we start talking about how much money we need to provide and how many people we need to take, let's just get rid of some of those practical barriers and help some of those women, some of those children, some of those older people to safety.
Yeah. Lisa, thank you very much for giving us lots to think about over the next couple of days if this announcement does come.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Great to have you. Well, it's interesting, Adam, I know ministers were meeting this afternoon to discuss, to try to make decisions about this sponsorship scheme, what the speed of it should be, what the scale of it should be, what the eligibility should be. And as Lisa was suggesting, I did a bit of digging around today on the existing sponsorship scheme, and I think it's only taken about 500 or 600 people in the last 5 years. Yeah. And it is very onerous, lots of paperwork, safeguarding checks, financial checks, all sorts of things. So I think there's going to be huge pressure on the government from the opposition and from some of their own MPs as well to come up with something that is quicker, bigger of scale, and many people might say bigger hearted, but none of this is straightforward.
Lovely to catch up with you all. And that's all for this episode of Newscast. Thank you for listening or watching, and we'll be back with another one very soon. Bye.
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 Newscast from the BBC.